Last time, we ended on a promise. We stood on a narrow plain between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, over the black stone of a king named Hammurabi, who tried to defeat his own death by carving his law into a pillar taller than a man, so that his name might outlast his body. And we promised that we would leave that land at last and follow the same thread, the record that outlives the king, westward, across the desert to another great river, and to a people who tried something far more audacious than carving a law into stone. They tried to carve themselves into stone. They set out to defeat death itself. The river is the Nile, and on a plateau above its western bank, where the green fields end and the red desert begins, they raised their answer. Picture it at dawn. A mountain, but a mountain with edges too clean, too straight, too deliberate to be anything the earth ever made. A four-sided peak of pale stone, so vast that a human being standing at its foot is smaller than a single one of the blocks it is built from. It has stood there for 4,500 years. It was old when Rome was young. We call these things tombs, but that word is far too small. Because to the people who built them, these were not resting places for the dead. They were machines, the largest machines the ancient world would ever build, engineered for a single, staggering purpose: to carry a dead king past death and make him live forever. This is the story of the greatest bet against death in human history. Who made it, how, and whether in the end it worked. But first, we have to clear away two ghosts, because they stand between almost everyone and the real story. Ask most people how the pyramids were built, and you hear one of two answers: slaves or aliens. And both of them are wrong. The image of the whip-driven slave horde is one of the most durable pictures in all of popular history. It comes largely from a single ancient source, the Greek writer Herodotus, who wrote of slave gangs raising the Great Pyramid. But Herodotus was writing around 450 before the Common Era, more than 2,000 years after that pyramid was finished. He was not a witness. He was repeating a story already 20 centuries old, told to him by local guides. And the ground itself tells a different tale. The second ghost is stranger and louder in our own time. The idea that human beings simply could not have done this, and that the real builders came from a lost civilization, or from the stars. We will deal with that one properly later, when we look at how these mountains were raised. For now, hold on to just this. There is no mystery here that requires an alien. Every tool, every quarry, every ramp, every worker's meal has been found in the sand, exactly where human hands left it. Because the truth is better than either ghost. The pyramids were built by Egyptians. A paid, fed, housed, and brilliantly organized workforce, part skilled professionals, part ordinary citizens serving their king. And we do not have to guess. We have their town, we have their graves, and we have a 4,500-year-old logbook written by one of the men who did the work, which we will read together before the end. Not slaves, not aliens. People. Now, let us go back to the beginning and ask the only question that really matters. Why? Why would a nation pour a century of its wealth and genius into a single king's tomb? To us, it can look like madness, a monument to one man's vanity. But it was not vanity. In its own way, it was perfectly logical once you understand what the Egyptians believed. And here we must step carefully and describe that belief the way they held it, with respect and without judgment. The Egyptians held that their king was not merely a ruler, he was a living god. In life, the earthly form of Horus, the falcon god of the sky and of kingship, and at his death, Osiris, lord of the dead and of resurrection. And that god had a task. He was the guarantor of Ma'at, a word that means truth and balance and the right order of the whole universe. It was the pharaoh's sacred duty to hold Ma'at in place, to keep the sun rising, the seasons turning, and the Nile flooding each year to feed the land. Without him, they believed, the order of the cosmos itself might unravel. So the king's survival in this life and beyond it was not a personal luxury. It was national survival insurance. And death, to the Egyptians, was not an ending, but a dangerous journey. They held that a person was made of several parts: the Ka, the life force, which had to be fed even after death; the Ba, the mobile soul; the Ak, the transfigured spirit that could rise and join the imperishable stars; and the Ren, the name, whose survival kept the whole person alive. Remember that last one, the name. It will matter more than anything else in this story. The tomb was the equipment for that journey, and the pyramid was the greatest piece of it ever devised. A resurrection engine of stone, shaped like a ramp to the sky and a stairway to the stars, and like the first mound of earth that rose from the waters at the creation of the world. It was built to shelter the body, to receive the offerings that fed the Ka, and to launch the king's spirit up to live among the gods. We even have the manual. In the pyramid of a king named Unas from around 2350 before the Common Era, the burial chamber is carved, for the first time, with what we call the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings known to humanity. And they read unmistakably like an operating manual for a machine built to defeat death. Understand the belief, and the impossible effort makes sense. A nation that thought the sunrise depended on its king would of course build him a mountain. So how do you build a mountain to defeat death? You do not begin with the Great Pyramid. You begin roughly a century earlier with a smaller and stranger monument, and with one of the first named geniuses in all of history. For Egypt's earliest kings, the tomb was a low, flat rectangle of mud brick called a mastaba, from the word for the bench it resembles. A house for the dead, close to the ground. Then, around 2670 before the Common Era, a king named Djoser and his brilliant chief minister, a man named Imhotep, did something no one had ever done. Imhotep was one of those rare figures the ancient world could barely contain: architect, priest, physician, sage. So revered that long after his death, the Egyptians would come to worship him as a god of wisdom and healing. For his king, at a place called Saqqara, he made two revolutionary choices. First, instead of mud brick, he built in cut stone, shaped and stacked to last not for a lifetime, but for eternity. And second, he did not stop at one flat mastaba. He built one, set a smaller one on top, and a smaller one on that again and again. 6 great steps, rising about 62 meters, a staircase climbing into the sky. It is the step pyramid of Djoser, the oldest large-scale cut stone monument on the face of the earth, the ancestor of every pyramid, and arguably every great stone building ever raised since. Why a stairway? The likeliest answer is also the most beautiful. It was exactly what it looks like. A staircase for the dead king to climb step by step up out of his tomb and into the heavens. The bet against death had begun, and here, at the crown of that first stone stairway, the light in our story first begins to glow.
But a stairway is not yet a true pyramid. Those clean, smooth, sloping sides we picture the moment we hear the word. Getting from one to the other took the reign of the most important pyramid builder almost no one has ever heard of. His name was Sneferu, and he came to the throne around 2613 before the Common Era. And here, you have to let go of the idea that the Egyptians already knew how. They did not. Sneferu had to work it out, and he failed his way to the answer, out in the open, across 3 enormous pyramids, moving more stone than any pharaoh in the whole of Egyptian history. His first attempt, at a site called Midum, began as a stepped pyramid, which his builders then tried to encase and make smooth. And something went wrong. The outer skin appears to have partly collapsed, sliding away and leaving a strange, stark tower rising from a mound of its own rubble, where, most likely, it still stands today. An experiment that broke. So he tried again at a place called Djoser, and this one is my favorite. They began building steeply at about 54 degrees, reaching confidently for height. And then, partway up, something frightened them. Cracks, perhaps, signs of strain, the fear that this one too might come crashing down. And you can watch the moment the engineers lost their nerve, frozen forever in the stone. About halfway up, the angle suddenly eases back to a safer, shallower 43 degrees. The result is a pyramid with a permanent kink in its sides. We call it the Bent Pyramid, a 4,500-year-old record of human beings realizing they had made a mistake and fixing it before it killed them. And then, having learned from a collapse and a near disaster, Sneferu built a 3rd time, and got it right. Again at Djoser, he raised what we call the Red Pyramid, the first true smooth-sided pyramid that actually worked, standing clean and stable and whole. The geometry was solved at last. Not by gods, and not by visitors from the stars, but by trial and error and the stubborn, patient ingenuity of human beings who kept making mistakes until they stopped. Which is a far greater story than magic.
Sneferu passed all of it, the solved geometry, the trained crews, the machinery of state, to his son, who pushed it to a limit that has never been equaled since. His name was Khufu, and around the year 2560 before the Common Era, on the plateau of Giza, he built the Great Pyramid. The numbers are almost impossible to feel. Roughly 2.3 million blocks of stone, weighing together something like 5 to 6 million tons. It stood originally about 146.5 meters tall, over 480 feet. But the true wonder is not the size, it is the precision. Its 4 sides are aligned to true north, south, east, and west to within a fraction of a single degree, and its base is level across that enormous footprint to within a few centimeters. And all of it was achieved with copper tools, rope, wooden sledges, sightlines to the stars, and staggering human organization. No lasers, no machines. And it walked. The Great Pyramid was the tallest structure built by human hands anywhere on the planet for about 3,800 years, not surpassed until the spire of a European cathedral around the year 1311 of the Common Era. It is today the last of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing. Khufu's son Khafre built the second of the 3 great Giza pyramids beside it. It looks even taller than his father's, a trick of higher ground, and of the cap of original polished casing it still wears at its very peak. And from a spur of rock at its foot, Khafre's workers carved a crouching lion with the face of a king to stand guard forever, the Great Sphinx. Then his successor, Menkaure, built the 3rd pyramid, and it is noticeably smaller. The greatest wave of ambition in human history had crested and was very quietly beginning to fall. One last thing before we leave Giza, because the pyramids in your mind's eye are not what the Egyptians saw. When they were new, these monuments were sheathed head to foot in polished white limestone, quarried across the river at a place called Tura. Not rough and brown and stepped, but smooth and blindingly bright. Vast mirrors of white stone blazing in the desert sun, some of them tipped with a gleaming, possibly gilded capstone that caught the first light of dawn. That white skin is mostly gone now, loosened by a medieval earthquake and carted off to help build the city of Cairo. But for thousands of years, what a traveler saw rising on the horizon was not a ruin. It was a blaze of white light on the edge of the world.
So how did they actually do it, with copper and rope and no machines at all? The honest answer has 2 parts. Some of it we know, and some of it we are still arguing about. Here is what we know. The core of each pyramid was cut from local limestone, quarried right there on the plateau. The fine white casing came from Tura, across the river. And for the great slabs that roof the king's chamber deep inside, the Egyptians used red granite, hauled some 800 kilometers down the Nile from Aswan in the far south. They shaped this stone with copper chisels and saws, and with pounding bowls of a hard, dark rock called dolerite. They moved the blocks on wooden sledges. And there is a lovely human detail preserved in an old tomb painting. To cut the friction as they dragged a colossal load across the sand, a man walks ahead of the sledge, pouring water on the ground before it. Wet sand is firmer and slicker than dry. They were not magicians. They were clever. And we know they used ramps. An actual construction ramp from Khufu's own reign survives at a quarry called Hatnob. What we do not fully know is exactly what shape the great ramp on the pyramid itself took. Straight up one face, spiraling around the outside, or winding up through the inside. Serious engineers and Egyptologists genuinely disagree, and that is an honest, open question, not a doorway for aliens. But here is the thing to hold on to. The deepest marvel of the pyramids was never some secret lost technology. It was organization. Feeding, housing, tooling, and coordinating tens of thousands of people well enough to set a 2.5-ton block into place every couple of minutes for 20 years, and land the whole mountain within a fraction of a degree of true north. And that, in the end, is the real answer to that second ghost. There is nothing in these monuments that people could not do, and everything in them that shows that they did. The quarries, the tools, the ramps, the villages, the marks of the work. To hand this achievement to visitors from the stars is not just unsupported by a single shred of evidence. It quietly takes the credit away from the ordinary, brilliant people who actually owned it, with rope and copper and the strength of their own backs.
Which brings us, at last, to the people themselves. The ones the movies turned into faceless slaves. Because in the 1990s, archaeologists found them. Right beside the Giza pyramids, the Egyptologist Mark Lehner uncovered an entire workers' town. Bakeries and breweries running at industrial scale, dormitories, workshops, even signs of medical care. A worker's broken bones set and healed. This was not a slave camp. It was a company town, built to feed and house a national workforce. And next to it, the archaeologist Zahi Hawass excavated something even more telling. The workers' cemetery. The men who built the pyramids were buried in honor, in their own tombs, right in the shadow of the king they had served, laid to rest with bread and beer for their own journeys into the afterlife. No one gives a slave a tomb beside his god-king and stocks it with provisions for his own eternity. And their bones show they ate well. Plenty of beef and mutton and goat. They were fed the way you feed valued people, not the way you work prisoners to death. And then there is the single most extraordinary find of all. In the year 2013, on the shore of the Red Sea, a French team led by Pierre Tillet discovered the oldest inscribed papyrus ever found, the daily logbook of a work gang inspector named Merer. In his own words, Merer records his team ferrying white limestone by boat to a place called Akhet Khufu, the Great Pyramid, in the 26th year of Khufu's reign. It is a first-hand receipt for the building of the Great Pyramid, written by one of the men who built it. A tiny scroll of reeds that outweighs 2,000 years of rumor. So let us be careful and precise about who these builders were. Not slaves, but not quite modern volunteers on a payroll either. The truth sits in a rich middle. A core of permanent skilled crews joined by rotating teams of ordinary Egyptians who very likely owed the crown a duty of labor. A duty perhaps served during the flood season when the fields lay underwater and the farmers were free. Organized into named gangs, paid in rations, fed, housed, and honored. And here we can quietly correct one last very common confusion. The people who built the pyramids were Egyptians, and they built them more than 1,000 years before the era the Exodus story describes. On that, the dates and the date simply agree. And Theo, we will leave it. And now, the turn. Because for all their genius, and all their faith, and all their staggering effort,
There is a devastating truth about the pyramids that we have not yet told you. They failed. At the one thing they were built to do, they failed almost completely. Think about what a pyramid actually is from the point of view of a thief. It is the largest, most visible object for hundreds of miles, a mountain-sized signpost pointing at the sky that announces, "Here lies a dead king, buried with the concentrated wealth of a kingdom." The pyramids did not hide their treasure, they advertised it. And the robbers came. Grave robbing in ancient Egypt was endemic, and the great tombs were broken into and emptied again and again, often within just a few generations of the king's burial. When explorers finally forced their way into the heart of the Great Pyramid, to the king's chamber at its core, they found the stone sarcophagus lidless and empty. Khufu was gone. The machine built to protect his body forever had failed to protect it at all. And the Egyptians knew it was failing. Even during the Pyramid Age, builders began moving the burial chamber, hiding it away from the obvious spot beneath the peak, trying to outwit the thieves. The advertisement was simply too good, and the security too poor. And so in time, Egypt did something astonishing. It gave up. After roughly 1,000 years and more than 100 pyramids, the pharaohs stopped building them. And the kings of a later age, around 1500 before the Common Era, did the exact opposite of Khufu. Instead of raising the most visible object on Earth, they tried to disappear. Beginning with a king named Thutmose I, the pharaohs were buried in hidden, disguised tombs, cut deep into the rock of a remote desert valley, the Valley of the Kings, and sealed away in secret. No one seeing, no one hearing, wrote the architect who dug the first of them. The whole strategy had flipped, from shouting to hiding. And why did the Great Age truly end? In part because the pyramids had failed as fortresses for the dead, but the civilization that built them faltered too. Around 2181 before the Common Era, the Old Kingdom itself collapsed into a long age of chaos, and scholars still genuinely debate why. Some point to a catastrophic, decades-long drought, failing Nile floods and famine, after the extraordinarily long reign of a king named Pepi II. Others point to the sheer grinding cost of centuries of pyramid building, and to power slowly bleeding away from the king toward provincial nobles. There is no single agreed answer, but the outcome is not in doubt. The machine, the wealth that fed it, and the faith that made it all make sense. In the end, all of it broke.
So, did it work? Did the greatest bet against death in human history pay off? By the only test the pharaohs themselves would have named, the answer is heartbreaking. They bet everything, 1,000 years of a civilization's wealth and genius, on preserving their bodies for eternity. And they lost. The bodies were stolen, the treasure was carried off, the gleaming white skin was stripped away for other men's walls. Even the tallest thing human beings had ever built ended up standing robbed and hollow in the sand. Its owner vanished. On its own terms, the machine failed. And yet, remember the last part of the soul? The Ren, the name. The Egyptians held that to speak the name of the dead was to make them live again, that a name still spoken was a person not truly gone. And by that measure, the one they believed in most deeply, the pyramids, did not fail at all. Khufu's body is dust, scattered and lost. But 4,500 years later, on the far side of the world, in a language he never heard, you and I have spent this whole story speaking his name. Khufu, Djoser, Sneferu. We say them still. Children learn them. The men who tried to buy eternal life for their bodies accidentally bought something far more durable. Eternal life for their names. And so the thread we have followed across all these stories comes to its sharpest point. Gilgamesh's story survived on clay, a comfort that a man's words can outlive him. Sargon's lost empire survives only as clay, a warning that nothing built by power endures. Hammurabi's law survived on stone, a promise kept. And now the pharaohs who raised whole mountains, a bet lost, and a stranger prize won. The record has hardened from a tablet to a pillar to a mountain of stone. Power cannot buy the eternity at once. Even a god king's own body is stolen from him in the end. And still,
the record endures. The monument outlives the man, and the name outlives everything. But the pharaohs were not finished trying. When mountains of stone could not keep the robbers out, they went underground, into that secret valley, into tombs sealed and disguised and hidden, praying only to be forgotten. And it almost never worked. The robbers found those too, one after another. Almost. Because once, just once, they missed one. A boy who became a king and died young, and was forgotten so completely that his small, crowded tomb slept untouched in the dark for 3,000 years. Until a man with a candle broke through a sealed door and found the only pharaoh's treasure the world has ever seen whole. That is where we go next time. Until then, if you want to understand how our world was built and how our oldest stories still shape it, stay with us and subscribe. The codex closes until the next story is written.